On our 10-year anniversary, I watched the man I built a life with stand up and humiliate me in front of his colleagues, disguised as a toast. I sat there, frozen, smiling through heartbreak, while the room laughed at what I used to be proud of. But what no one saw coming was the man who walked in next. The one who remembered who I really was, before I ever had to shrink to fit someone else's world. And trust me, by the end of the night, I didn't need revenge. I had something better. There are moments in life that are supposed to shimmer, milestones that glitter with the promise of love, legacy, and celebration. For Camille, this night was supposed to be one of those moments. A 10-year anniversary with the man she'd built a life with. A decade marked by shared sacrifices, late-night conversations, quiet support, and louder silence. She had picked the restaurant carefully, Blue Vine Estate, elegant, exclusive, revered by London's legal elite. The kind of place where reputation was currency and every detail whispered legacy. But legacy was a strange thing for Camille. She was the daughter of resilience. Raised in Birmingham, Alabama by a jazz pianist father who never compromised his art and a mother who taught history with a kind of fervor that made students sit up straighter. Camille had grown up surrounded by vinyl records, fresh cornbread, stories about freedom fighters, and a deep belief that who you were mattered more than what you wore. So when she fell in love with Marcus, a man whose ambition burned like wildfire, she thought they were building something meaningful. And for a time, they were. He had admired her confidence, her poise, the way she could quote Baldwin and bake a peach cobbler in the same breath. She had stood by him through the grueling years of law school, helped edit his first case summaries, and clapped the loudest when he made senior so sit. But something shifted when success came knocking. Marcus got sharper suits, tighter routines, and colder eyes. The man who once called her his queen now seemed to glance past her. At dinners with his colleagues, Camille noticed how her accent seemed to startle them, how her stories landed with polite, tight-lipped smiles. And Marcus never corrected them when they assumed she was from abroad. He just let her shrink, gently and consistently, in every room they walked into together. Still, she believed in commitment. She believed people changed. She believed marriages had seasons. So she decided to make this anniversary count. To remind him, and maybe herself, why they had chosen each other in the first place. She planned everything. The guest list was small but significant. A few key partners from his firm. Their spouses. The ones Marcus was always trying to impress. Camille chose a deep emerald dress that hugged her like confidence and styled her curls in a way that felt both regal and free. She rehearsed her toast, funny, heartfelt, nostalgic. She didn't want to just mark the occasion. She wanted to revive it. But the evening had a chill she hadn't anticipated. From the moment they entered, she felt like an accessory. Marcus greeted people with the polish of a man curating an image. Camille noticed how he introduced her. This is Camille, full stop. No embellishment. No warmth. Just a name. At the table, laughter was stilted. Melanie, the wife of Marcus's mentor, kept smiling at Camille the way one smiles at a pet doing tricks. Richard, the senior partner, made jokes that Camille couldn't tell were at her expense or simply beneath her. And yet, Camille smiled. She played the role. Because tonight, she was supposed to be the proof that Marcus had it all, the career, the connections, the cultured wife. But before dessert would even arrive, before Camille could raise her glass for that perfectly crafted toast, everything would shift. One word would unravel the illusion. And Camille, the woman who had spent too long softening herself to fit into a world built on pretense, would finally remember how to stand tall. This wasn't going to be an anniversary to remember. It was going to be a reckoning. The clinking of glasses signaled the next course, but the tension at the table couldn't be stirred away by waiters in white gloves. Camille sat with her back straight, fingers tracing the stem of her glass, heart thumping beneath her calm exterior. The toast she had rehearsed 3 times in the mirror was neatly folded in her clutch. She had timed it perfectly, light enough to draw laughter, poignant enough to pull Marcus back to their shared story. But Marcus beat her to it. He stood without warning, his smile broad but empty. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, raising his glass, "thank you for being here to celebrate a decade of commitment. 10 years of learning, of partnership, and, let's be honest, of adaptation." Adaptation. The word landed in Camille's chest like a stone in still water. She looked around. Richard chuckled knowingly. Melanie smirked into her flute. And Marcus kept talking. Camille has always been someone who rises to the occasion. Whether it's adjusting to the professional circles I now move in, or learning to appreciate the finer things in life, she's shown such resilience.
It was meant to sound admiring,
but every syllable chipped at the woman she was. Camille could feel the air change, her body flushing not from the wine, but from the thinly veiled condescension wrapped in praise.
The worst part, no one seemed surprised.
Melanie leaned over and whispered, "You're really something, Camille.
I'd never guess you were from Alabama.
You carry yourself so well."
It took everything in her to stay seated. Camille smiled. Tight, cordial, controlled, but something inside her began to shift.
The script she had written in her head, the carefully edited speech full of nostalgia and forgiveness, burned quietly to ash in her mind. She stood. "May I?" she said, lifting her glass.
Marcus looked startled. "Of course." Camille cleared her throat.
Every face turned toward her. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with clarity.
She wasn't going to perform. Not tonight. Not anymore.
10 years ago, she began, I married a man who said he loved my fire.
My stories. My passion.
He used to say I reminded him of home.
Back when home still meant something real.
Not curated. A quiet hush fell over the table. But what I've learned over these 10 years, she continued, is that love built on acceptance only matters if it doesn't turn into assimilation. I haven't adapted. I've endured. I've folded myself into smaller and smaller shapes just to make others comfortable.
She looked at Marcus, her voice firm.
But I finally remembered that shrinking to stay in someone else's frame isn't love. It's erasure.
She sat down. No one clapped. No one moved. Marcus opened his mouth but said nothing.
Melanie blinked fast, clearly unsure whether to look shocked or offended. And Richard cleared his throat, suddenly very interested in his dessert spoon.
Camille didn't need their validation. Her truth had already been released.
And the room had no idea at all, that this wasn't the peak of the evening. Because just as the silence began to settle, the maître d' approached with an apologetic smile. There's a gentleman here asking for Ms. Camille. He says he was invited by Richard.
Marcus furrowed his brow. Camille turned slowly.
And when she saw who stood just beyond the velvet entrance, her heart didn't race.
It settled.
Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition. The man standing at the threshold wasn't just a familiar face.
He was a chapter Camille had shelved but never forgotten. Jordan Hayes. Tall. Poised. Calm as always.
Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit like it had been made just for him, because it probably had. The last time Camille saw him was 8 years ago at a youth leadership conference in D.C., where they had both been speakers. Back then, he was already building a reputation as a bold, community-driven strategist. Now, he was the founder of Hayes Impact Group, an international consultancy specializing in equitable development. In short, he had become the kind of man Marcus's firm would fawn over if he weren't so unapologetically principled. Camille stood up, stunned but smiling. Jordan.
He walked in, ignoring the curious glances from the guests.
I heard there was a celebration happening tonight, he said, flashing a warm grin. Richard invited me, something about networking. But I had no idea it was your anniversary dinner. You look radiant, Camille. Her face flushed, not with embarrassment, but with something she hadn't felt all evening, visibility. Jordan turned to Marcus, who now stood awkwardly, eyes narrowed.
Marcus. Been a while.
Marcus forced a smile. Yes, since Cambridge, I believe. What brings you to London? Jordan glanced at Camille, then back at the room. Business, of course.
But now that I'm here, I'd love to stay. Unless this is a private gathering. Camille held out her hand.
You're welcome.
Please.
Jordan took the empty seat beside her, and in that instant, the entire balance of the room shifted.
Conversations quieted.
All eyes seemed to flicker between Marcus and Camille, between what was and what now sat inches away from her, representing everything she had been told she could never have without surrendering who she was. As dinner resumed, Jordan's presence transformed the energy. He leaned into Camille, asking about her recent projects, her writing, the mentorship program she had quietly started for black girls in South London. He spoke to her like she was the star of the evening. Like her voice wasn't just welcome, it was necessary. Marcus, meanwhile, grew quieter. The confidence he had worn like armor at the start of the night began to crumble with every moment. Jordan and Camille laughed, connected, reminisced. Melanie whispered something to Richard, who simply looked like he'd made a massive miscalculation.
And then, the final blow.
Richard cleared his throat, raising his glass again. I'd just like to add that Jordan's firm has been shortlisted to lead our community reinvestment initiative. It's not finalized yet, but it's looking promising.
Jordan smiled politely.
And I've asked Camille to come on as a co-lead consultant for the UK division. Her insight is unmatched.
The room went silent. Marcus's face drained of color.
Camille sipped her wine, slowly. I hadn't announced it yet, she said calmly, but since we're celebrating.
It was no longer an anniversary dinner. It was a coronation.
And for the first time that night, Camille didn't feel like she was shrinking into the background.
She was the main event.
As the final clinks of cutlery echoed off the polished walls, no one at the table knew what to say. Camille had rewritten the script of the evening, and now every player looked off cue. Jordan sat beside her, composed and attentive, but never overbearing. His presence had disrupted the curated illusion Marcus had worked so hard to maintain, a life that presented as polished perfection but was cracked underneath with insecurity and pretense. Now, the truth was exposed under the soft glow of chandeliers. Marcus tried to recover. Well, that's unexpected, he muttered with a forced laugh. But congratulations, Camille. You didn't mention this new role. Camille tilted her head slightly, her voice unshaken.
You didn't ask. Silence fell again, thicker this time. Melanie's fork hovered in midair.
Richard cleared his throat, trying to smooth things over. It's a great match, really. Camille's background and Jordan's vision, it's the kind of partnership that can make real change. But it was too late to tidy what had unraveled. Marcus stared at Camille like he no longer recognized her. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he had spent so long sculpting her into a version he could parade around that he forgot who she truly was.
And that truth? It wasn't meek. It wasn't moldable. It was magnificent. The car ride home was quiet.
Marcus didn't speak. Camille didn't offer. She watched the street lights flicker past the window, her hand resting calmly on her lap. She wasn't angry, at least, not in the way she used to be. The kind that made you cry quietly in bathrooms or feel invisible in rooms full of people. No, this was a different feeling entirely.
Peace.
That night, after Marcus had slipped into their bedroom and turned his back to her, as he had so many times before, Camille opened her laptop. She pulled up the consulting agreement Jordan had sent weeks earlier. Her cursor hovered for only a moment before clicking sign. The next morning, over breakfast, she slid the signed contract across the table.
I've accepted the role.
I'll be heading up the London division of Hayes Impact. Marcus looked up from his coffee, confused. You're really doing this?
Camille nodded. I've been ready.
I just needed to stop waiting for your approval to move. He tried to object, to discuss logistics, to ask what this meant for their relationship. But Camille had already stepped off the stage of his carefully scripted life.
She wasn't playing supporting character anymore.
Over the next few weeks, the distance between them became undeniable. Camille moved into a new flat closer to the office. She reclaimed the hours she once spent second-guessing herself and poured them into building something real, impactful, hers.
Jordan didn't hover or push. He simply checked in. Brought coffee when she worked late.
Made her laugh during hard days. Reminded her what it felt like to be seen without being edited. One afternoon, while reviewing a campaign brief, Jordan looked at her thoughtfully. You know, the way you handled that dinner, it wasn't just graceful. It was revolutionary.
Camille smiled. It wasn't about revenge. It was about release. And that was the difference. She didn't want to win Marcus back. She wanted to win herself forward.
There's a strange freedom that comes when you realize you've been living your life to be palatable to others. Camille had spent years trying to mold herself into what Marcus, and by extension, his world, deemed respectable.
But now, she was stepping into something entirely new. Not a rebellion. A reclamation.
In her new role at Hayes Impact, Camille blossomed in ways that startled even her.
Her days were full but fulfilling. The kind of work that didn't just tick boxes but changed lives.
She was crafting campaigns that spoke directly to underrepresented communities, building bridges instead of billboards. The passion that had always lived in her now had purpose again, and she didn't have to trade her truth to use her talent. The office was buzzing with energy the day Camille launched her first campaign, Rooted Voices, a platform amplifying grassroots changemakers across London. She walked into the briefing room to a standing ovation from her new team. Not because she'd catered to corporate jargon, but because she brought clarity, empathy, and unapologetic vision. That night, she and Jordan went out for dinner, not as colleagues, but as two people slowly uncovering something more. They didn't rush it.
They didn't have to. They laughed until their ribs hurt.
They debated everything from jazz to justice. When Jordan leaned in and said, "You're something else, Camille," it didn't feel like flattery.
It felt like recognition.
Meanwhile, Marcus watched from a distance. Word had traveled fast. Camille had become a respected voice in a space his firm had been struggling to navigate authentically. Clients started mentioning her name in meetings. A few even suggested her consultancy over his own. The irony wasn't lost on him. One afternoon, they ran into each other outside a conference venue.
Camille had just finished a panel. Marcus had come to scout talent.
"You looked powerful up there," he said, his voice quieter than usual.
Camille smiled.
"Thank you."
"You're really doing it," he said.
"Not just fitting in, you're shaping the room."
"I was always capable," she replied.
"I just stopped asking for permission."
He nodded slowly. There was no bitterness in her tone. No venom. Just truth. "I'm glad," he said.
"Even if I wasn't the man to see it first."
"That's okay," she said.
"You weren't meant to be."
They parted with a handshake, not longing.
Later that night, Camille journaled like she used to before life became about optics. She wrote not just about survival, but about impact.
Growth. Joy.
She wrote about choosing herself, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of love. For the first time in years, she felt like she was standing firmly in her own story.
No edits. No footnotes.
And as she looked in the mirror, she didn't see someone who had been left behind.
She saw someone who had arrived.
Camille stood on the rooftop of Hayes Impact's new headquarters, the London skyline glowing in the twilight. It had been a year since that anniversary dinner, 12 months since she quietly but completely took back her narrative. She was no longer defined by the way Marcus or his colleagues saw her. She was defined by her own reflection, her own purpose, her own pace.
There was no cinematic revenge. No dramatic reckoning. Just life, moving forward on her terms.
And yet, the justice of it all was undeniable. Her foundation, now fully funded, had helped over 200 young black women across the UK access mentorship, funding, and startup guidance. She gave talks across Europe, not as someone representing a firm, but as someone representing herself.
She no longer had to rehearse acceptance speeches in her head.
Her presence in the room was no longer a surprise. It was expected.
She'd run into Marcus a few more times.
Once at a charity gala, another time at a media panel where she was the keynote and he was an attendee. Their conversations were always civil, even warm at times. But Camille felt no pull. No regret. Marcus had once tried to clip her wings for the sake of his image. Jordan, by contrast, never tried to own her spotlight. He simply stood beside it. They hadn't rushed their relationship. Camille had been careful not to mistake validation for love or chemistry for safety.
But Jordan proved consistent.
Steady.
Curious. He asked questions no one else bothered to ask. He respected boundaries.
He never once tried to correct her when she got passionate or emotional. He leaned in. One evening over dinner, he told her, "You don't have to be strong all the time with me."
Camille teared up.
Not because she was sad, but because she finally believed it. They didn't get married in a grand hall with designer gowns and guest lists curated for status. They exchanged vows in a greenhouse in Brighton, surrounded by friends who had seen them at their worst and loved them through it.
Camille wore her curls wild and free. Her vows were handwritten. Jordan cried. Afterward, she stood under the stars with her sister by her side.
"You ever think about that dinner?" Denise asked, sipping champagne. "Sometimes," Camille said.
"Not out of pain. Just as a reminder."
"A reminder of what?"
"That shrinking never protected me. It just delayed my rise."
Her sister smiled and raised her glass.
"To never shrinking again."
Camille raised hers too. "To building rooms instead of trying to fit into them."
That was the real message.
If you've ever felt too loud, too bold, too different, this story is your reminder. You don't need to adjust your volume to be accepted. The right people won't just make space for your voice, they'll amplify it. Your truth doesn't need polishing. It needs to be heard. So if Camille's journey made something stir in your chest, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs the courage to walk out of someone else's story and into their own. And tell us in the comments, when did you stop shrinking? Because the day you choose yourself is the day the world finally meets you. Some stories don't just entertain, they wake something up inside you. And maybe, just maybe, this was one of them. Tap like if you felt seen. Share it with someone who's still shrinking themselves to fit into rooms they were never meant to be in. And subscribe, because the stories coming next aren't just powerful, they are personal. Now tell me in the comments, what was your breaking point? The moment you stopped asking for permission to be you?